right now. So let's get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today and joining us to celebrate the launch of the much anticipated Policy Design Guidebook. Over the last year, Amanda Janou, who is with us today, has facilitated this process. Yes, so over the last year, Amanda Janou has facilitated this process that's engaged over 70 plus people in the We All community to co-create this document that's intended to support policymakers all over the world. So we hope that you all leave today with this feeling of agency, like you have a role to play in co-creating an economic system that works for people and planet. And we want you all to more deeply understand that we are the economy, and therefore we can prioritize what's actually important to each of us, not just what politicians think is important. So with that said, I'd like to introduce our amazing set of panelists today. So first we have Amanda Janou, who is the We All Knowledge and Policy Lead, she is the main author of the guide and the woman that pulled this incredible initiative together. She comes from an international development background, and she saw firsthand the issues of policymaking, like particularly how prescriptive and like this consultant focused, business focused policies that don't prioritize communities whatsoever. And that perspective inspired her to then develop this guide. And we're very excited to have it actually now out, published, and to see what kind of impact it can make. With her today, she's invited two contributors of the guide to give insight about how they see the guide being practically used in their community. So we have Paul and Andy, and I will introduce both of them before they speak. And the way that the session will run today is we'll have Amanda kick off with a presentation. Then I'll have Paul speak, he's from New Zealand, and then Andy will speak, and he's from Liverpool City region. So with that said, Amanda, I'm gonna kick it over to you. And yeah, let's do it.
Wonderful. Well, good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone. I can't believe that we've got almost 100 people here from all over the world. So I'm just going to share a screen and start this presentation. Can everybody see? Yes. Okay. Good.
Yes, can see.
Wonderful. So we won't have time to go into every detail of this guide, but over the next about 25 minutes or so, what I want to provide you is an overview of some of the key principles and processes and ideas that are explored in this guide, as well as some next steps and ways for you to get involved as well. So before we dive into the guide itself, I think it's always good to provide some context and to think about what is this well-being economy movement and why is it so important? So Albert Einstein once said that perfection of means and confusion of ends seems to characterize our age. And I think that there is no area where this confusion is more evident than when it comes to the economy. So for decades, we've been focusing on generating wealth and boosting GDP. And as a result, we've gotten pretty good at it. So at this point, we've got over $400 trillion in wealth, which if you were to distribute it across everybody living in the world would be about $70,000 per person. But the issue is that the ways in which we're generating this wealth and utilizing it is not leading to improvements in well-being anymore. And in fact, is actively leaving a lot of us worse off. So right now, of course, we see that this system, this economic system, is creating absurd levels of inequality, with 8 people now owning as much wealth as half of humanity. And with this inequality between and amongst communities only getting worse. We also are facing an incredible environmental crisis. So our planet, our home, is being destroyed. Climate change and biodiversity loss is is increasing at incredible rates. And in the midst of all of this, we're seeing all around the world increasing levels of alienation, despair, and distress. And then you add on top of this a global pandemic, and it becomes very clear that we're not headed in a very good direction, right? And one of the really frustrating things is that in the midst of all of these very urgent crises, we can feel like our policymakers are just promoting the economy above all else, as if it seems easier to imagine the total destruction of people and planet than to imagine a different economic system. But what's important here to recognize is that this is because for a long time, we had a story where the number one purpose of government was to promote economic growth. And this was because by promoting the growth of the economy, you would generate more money and you could take some of that money to sort of fix the damage that was done to people and planet in the process. But this isn't a really efficient way to go about it. And people are starting to really lose faith in their government institutions and also in our economic system and are demanding a change. So the question of our age becomes, how do we move from just fixing the negative outcomes of our economy to actively building an economy that gets it right in the first place? How do we build economies that actively regenerate our natural world and that provide the things that we need as individuals and as societies for a good life and for flourishing? And this idea is really at the center of the well-being economy movement. It's about a vision for developing an economy that does more of the heavy lifting and that ensures that all people are provided for their fundamental need for participation, dignity, nature, fairness, and connection. Around the world, the well-being economy movement comes under a lot of different banners, such as inclusive and sustainable development, regenerative economies, degrowth, circular economy, and many more. But what all of these movements have in common is a recognition that people and planet are not here to serve the economy. It is here to serve us, and that we have the power to build an economic system that delivers social justice on a healthy planet. So all of that sounds great, right? But how do we actually get there? How do we build a well-being economy that really works in service of people and planet? This was the question that prompted us to develop this policy design guide. So you'll find peppered throughout this guide quotes from all of the various members who helped to build this guide over the past year. And one of these quotes is by one of our members, Till, and I think he summarizes the motivation for this guide really well when he says, the flaws in mainstream economics and GDP are well known, but what is needed is a practical guide on how to build a well-being economy and how to organize this transition in a democratic and participatory way. Such a guide can help us to really institutionalize this process, give tools to policymakers, and really importantly, present the well-being economy as a feasible alternative. And so this was really at the core of this initiative for us, moving beyond a vision of just critique and seeing what's wrong with the system to proactively thinking about how we can go build the better world we envision. So at the beginning of this process, we spent a lot of times really thinking about what principles needed to underpin this guide and a policy design process for a well-being economy. And I won't go into all of the principles right now, but I do want to highlight a few that I think are particularly important for you to really understand why the guide is structured the way it is and why it includes the kind of content that it does. And so the first is the importance of a contextual approach. So one of the most damaging aspects of our current economic system is this very one-size-fits-all approach that has led to cultural homogenization, disempowerment, and inappropriate policies worldwide. Because once we recognize that the economy is just the way we produce and provide for one another, you realize that the way you produce and provide things is influenced by your history, your geography, your politics, your culture, and so much more. And so therefore, well-being economies will look different in different places, as will their journeys. And so we need to allow space for the diversity of approaches. Another core principle in this guide is the principle of participation. So reason why participation is important is because broad-based engagement not only leads to more inclusive and sustainable outcomes, but because the process of participation itself is important for well-being. We know that we have this fundamental need to feel like we have a voice over the decisions that impact our lives. And so throughout this guide, you'll find strong emphasis on co-creative, deliberative, and participatory approaches to policy design and implementation. And finally, I'd like to draw your attention to the principle of taking a strength-based approach, because this is actually a pretty radical shift, as standard economic policy is really about deficit or problems-based approach. We generally begin with a consideration of the challenges, the problems, or the things that we're lacking. And then we focus on trying to deal with them, as opposed to identifying our positive aspirations, looking to see what strengths and capacities we already have, and then utilizing those and building upon them to achieve our goals. And this is transformative because it moves the government from simply correcting market failures, as we'd say, to proactively building the better world and economic system that we envision. So what does this mean in practice? And what does this mean for the guide? How does this translate into a different approach for policy design? The reality is that we're talking about an emergent process. And so there is no clear path. But we've decided to structure this guide according to 5 stages: vision, strategy, policies, implementation, and evaluation. Now, in reading the guide, it will be tempting to sort of view this as a step-by-step manual, but it's not. The reality is that all of these various processes and ideas are interconnected with one another and support one another. And therefore, we encourage you to experiment with different combinations and add in new processes where you need. But all we ask is that you'll share your experience with us. And so without further ado, let's dive into the guide itself. So the first stage in the guide is about developing your well-being vision, expanding our notion of progress, and really becoming clearer on what kind of society and world we want to live in. Because having this clear vision is so important for then seeing what kind of actions are necessary to build this. It's about moving beyond measuring our progress by our level of GDP to really measuring our success by our level of well-being. And so your well-being vision acts as your North Star. It's the way in which you can get a lot of people involved in the transformative journey ahead. And as you think about developing this vision, some questions emerge, like how do we understand what really matters for well-being? How do we craft and communicate this well-being vision? And how do we measure well-being so that we can remain on course? So let's start with the first, which is understanding what matters for well-being. So I promise you this is the only time I'll show you the actual guide itself, but I wanted to show you because this is an example of one of the pages in the guide. And so for each of the processes that we'll speak about today, what you'll find is this area here that says how. And so for this, for example, how do we understand what matters for well-being? There are a variety of different approaches with hyperlinks to tools and resources that can support you to operationalize these ideas. And so whilst it's important to show a variety of approaches, we also have we all tips. And this is where we sort of give more of our opinions and ideas and suggestions on how we think you could go about this process in the best way. And from our perspective, the best way to understand well-being is to ask people. Have them engage in discussions around what really matters for their lives, because this process of discussion is transformative in and of itself. And so in the case of Germany, for example, when they wanted to understand what mattered for well-being, they held over 200 public consultations all over their country, as well as online forums, and asked the question, what matters to us? And what's interesting here is that when you ask people what matters, you end up with a mix of values such as peace and respect and equity. And then you also have things like outcomes where you have work-life balance or unspoiled nature. And then also processes like civic engagement and political participation. And so, whilst we tend still to focus on outcomes because they're the most tangible, a really exciting new area is how values are being integrated into policy design processes. And we'll speak a little bit more about that when we come to policies. The next thing we will sort of process that we look into is how to craft and communicate your well-being vision. And this is really important because ultimately, in order to get a lot of people engaged, you need to involve them and communicate with them in a way that really resonates with their vision for the world. So different governments communicate their well-being vision in different ways. Sometimes it's in a form of an infograph, sometimes it's in the form of a short written statement, or here, for example, what we see is the use of art as a way to present a vision for the future. And this is the example of Buen Vivir from Ecuador, which is based in an indigenous conception of well-being as achieving harmony amongst societies and with our natural environment. And then with your vision sort of set, comes the questions around measuring well-being. And so this is probably the area where we're seeing the most energy in the well-being economy movement right now. And that's for good reason, because we see the power and also the damage that such a single-minded fixation on GDP has had. And so I want to make a little shameless promotion here for a paper that our brilliant member Rutger Hoekstra wrote for We All, which is on this topic, because it illustrates that there's thousands, of well-being economy or beyond GDP measurements now, but sort of looks into what are the challenges of that adoption. But what I want to be clear on here is that you won't find in this guide us telling you which well-being indicators to use, but rather you'll find suggestions on how to develop well-being indicators. And one of my favorite examples comes from Wales. As while they were developing their well-being framework, they decided that effective communication was a really important criteria when selecting their indicators, and that it was important that any indicator they chose could be easily communicated and understood by a general audience. And this is really huge because I worked for a long time training policymakers in economic analysis. And honestly, the ability for people to intuitively understand the statistics that you are using is so vital for promoting really transformative change. All right. And so with this, we move to the next stage, which is about developing a well-being economy strategy. This is about putting our vision into action and really thinking about the concrete changes that are required to achieve that vision. Now, there are obviously a lot of relevant processes that could go into this, but we decided to start with three, which is about identifying well-being economy activities and behaviors, aligning institutions and stakeholders, and managing trade-offs and power dynamics. So let's start with the identification of well-being economy activities and behaviors, because this requires a pretty big shift. Because for a long time, we've held this narrative that the economy's purpose is to generate wealth. And so therefore, we promoted big businesses and investors because they were viewed as being the ones who are the most efficient at generating wealth. But as we shift our vision of progress, we also need to shift that narrative and really begin to consider which economic activities and behaviors are important for well-being. So then we can identify how best to support and foster those. COVID-19 has been a really interesting example in this regard, as it did not take policymakers very long to come up with a list of which economic sectors and activities were viewed as most critical for society. And with this, while there were some differences across countries, there were some similarities as well, with healthcare workers, teachers, farmers, grocery clerks, or government workers being viewed and classified as essential, despite the fact that they are not necessarily the ones who are paid the most within our societies. The challenge, therefore, is now to expand this kind of thinking and really consider what activities and behaviors are important for the future, and to allow ourselves to expand our imaginations so that we can develop strategies and encourage and reward areas and behaviors like generosity or stewardship and environmental generation, for example. Another area where we're seeing some really exciting um, initiatives is in institutional alignment. So, for a long time, we had a pretty siloed approach, right? So, different people have expertise in their respective areas, and we'll work on those accordingly. But now, we're seeing a more holistic and integrated strategy development by governments so that all agents in society are working collaboratively to build a well-being economy or to achieve their collective goals and objectives. So, one of my favorite case studies in this guide is the Envision Utah initiative, because it began in the 1990s with the government of Utah recognizing that their economy was growing really quickly. And they were concerned about the damage that this was going to do to their environment and to people's quality of life if it wasn't strategically managed. So, they decided to develop a participatory process so that citizens could engage and input in developing a new economic strategy. And at first, they faced a lot of resistance to this because there were a lot of different towns and a lot of different agencies and different areas of government that felt that they were in charge of managing their economies. And many powerful stakeholders who still held really paternalistic views and were not convinced that we should engage citizens in something as technical as economic planning. But in the end, they were able to convince and get people and get widespread buy in for this project by, first of all, presenting it as a long term initiative. Yeah, so it wasn't going to be confined by any political or administrative cycle. Two, they framed it as visioning rather than planning, because in this way it wasn't constrained by a narrow sort of technical process. And third, they presented it as a continuous process so that it wasn't just viewed as a project that was going to be constrained by a short term, sort of managerial driven initiative. And it did take time. So it took several years for them to do a lot of public awareness raising, data gathering, public dialogue, and participatory workshops to develop a new economic strategy. But in the end, Envision Utah is still going strong some 20 years later and has now been integrated into the policy design process as a way in which citizens are invited to determine the ways in which the economy is growing. And this is when then we get into the really tricky stuff, yeah, which is the reality is that building a well-being economy, you're gonna have to confront power imbalances and recognize that in order for certain activities and behaviors to flourish, others will need to decline. And managing these trade-offs is not easy. But a great example of this is the just transition movement, where we see some really inspiring, co creative, and democratic approaches to sunsetting environmentally harmful industries in a way that is just and fair to workers and communities whose livelihoods depend on them. And with this, let's move to the third section in this guide. And this is, obviously, I think, one of the most exciting sort of areas of this work, and a lot where we're seeing opportunities for a huge amount of innovation. When we're trying to achieve something as transformative as building a well-being economy, individual progressive policies are great, but an integrated, coherent policy package is better. Policies are the way that we encourage particular kinds of behavior relative to others. And it's important to look at what existing policies are already in place and how they align with the values and objectives that you've set. Because oftentimes we've developed a ton of policies, right, on the basis of certain existing power dynamics and structural factors. And in order to meaningfully transform the system, we want to have an understanding of that existing landscape before adding new ones in. Now, in working in economic policy for about a decade, I can say that this is something that really rarely happens, as we tend to be excited and focused on developing something new rather than assessing and reforming what's already there. And so there is a lot of space for, I think, innovation in this area. And in particular, I think there is a huge opportunity to develop new ways of assessing policies that move us beyond monetary cost and benefit, and really consider how policies relate to current and future well-being. So, an exciting example of where we're seeing progress in this area is gender budgeting, and now also increasing racial budgeting initiatives around the world that are really shining a light on how do existing policies maintain inequalities or and continue the marginalization of certain groups. And this is an example of where you see a value like equity becoming the frame by which to evaluate policies and their effectiveness. And so Iceland, for example, is already looking to learn from their gender budgeting initiative to develop well-being policy assessment tools. And I think in the coming years, we'll see a lot of exciting progress in this area and begin to evaluate policies according to their alignment with our values, as opposed to their revenue generating potential. And all right, so if you haven't picked up on it yet, this guide is all about co-creation. And honestly, we're not alone in this thinking because we're seeing all around the world, especially in the last few years, more and more participatory policy initiatives popping up. So people want to be engaged in developing policies, and there are now incredible public facilitation and technological tools that can support you with this. One great example that you may want to check out is the Dedisem Barcelona initiative, as it helps to provide spaces for people to engage in both in-person and online policy design processes as a way of revitalizing democracy and promoting transformative change. So I won't go into as much detail for the final two stages of this guide because I want to allow time for my brilliant co-authors, Paul and Andy, to speak as well. But I do want to touch on a few key points in the areas of implementation and evaluation. Because in my experience, the biggest issue with economic policy comes when it becomes time for implementation. Yeah. So working in international development, there are no shortage of economic experts and McKinsey consultants who would come in and develop these beautiful, fancy, strategic policy documents. But at best, these documents would end up sitting on a shelf somewhere, never be looked at again. And at worst, people would actually try to implement something that they didn't fully understand and honestly was often not in their interest. And as a result, you ended up having a huge disconnect between what was planned in theory and what actually ended up happening in reality. And so people need to be active agents throughout this whole process, right? But particularly when it comes to designing and adapting and implementing policies in alignment with their context. And I realize that this is no small feat, but we can find some great examples from governments relinquishing control, and empowering local communities to really implement, monitor, and align policies to their context. So I love the example of the Barrios Verdad in La Paz, because after decades of failed poverty alleviation initiatives, they decided to just give poor neighborhoods in La Paz the power to design their own infrastructure and community development projects. And so these communities would come up with their ideas, and then the government would just give them the money that they needed to implement them, plus some extra, so that in the event that they needed to adapt or found some new ideas that would complement these strategies, they could integrate them in. And the well-being impacts of this initiative have been enormous, and the sustainability of it has been enormous, that it's piqued so much interest in the development community. And so, speaking of impacts, let's go to evaluation before we end with next steps and a call to action. So, evaluations and assessments, this can be both quantitative and qualitative, are critical at all of the different sort of processes we mentioned, right? Because they provide us with the information and evidence we need to make strategic and informed decisions. And with the rise of well-being measurements, we're seeing governments from beginning to implement a lot more well-being assessments. So, Scotland, for example, has been using their national performance framework and the SDGs to understand trends in well-being and identify strategic points for intervention. Evaluations like this and assessments like this are really helpful for understanding what works and what doesn't. But more than anything, yeah, I think this also involves a bit of a cultural shift and a need to really embrace experimentation and learning. And this can be really hard for policymakers who feel like they can't fail. But what we need to realize is that we are all ourselves policymakers, and therefore we're trailblazers in this area. And what we're trying to achieve here, especially with the well-being economy movement, is something new. And so there's as much to learn from failure as there is success. And ultimately, what we need to develop are collective mechanisms for learning and reflection so that we don't feel constrained by fear, but we feel open to honestly be brave and experiment and to find really innovative and new strategies and policies moving forward, whilst also being patient and recognizing that many times the most important work that we're going to do is not going to be accounted for within an annual KPI. So, with this, I hope that I've convinced you to read the guide. It's not long and there's a lot of pictures, but if not, I hope that you at least feel like you've gotten a good flavor of what this guide is about. And so I want to end by being clear that the purpose of this guide is not to create a nice looking PDF, but rather to encourage and promote action. We want to illustrate that a well-being economy is not only possible, but it's already happening, and that you can be a part and an agent of this transformation. And that what we need is to just try. And so, in the months and years to come, we plan to put these ideas into action by rolling out this guide in Scotland, Canada, California, and New Zealand, and hopefully in your community and country as well. We'll be building a global policymakers network where civil servants from any level and from any country can come together and share best practice and challenges and learn together and dive into content and figure out how to build a well-being economy together. And importantly, we really want to use this guide as a way to build popular momentum, to remind people that we are the economy and that we can be engaged in molding and directing it according to our objectives. And finally, we want this to be a living document. So we want it to continuously grow and develop as you share more tools and case studies and experiences with us. And to be honest with you, promoting this kind of transformation in economic policy, although it's happening more and more, it's not an easy thing, right? And so we need your help. And so if you're not a member of We All, I hope that you will join our family, because our goal is to try to build the power bases needed to really transform this economic system. And you are a vital part of this. I hope that you will join We All and also engage in our We All Citizens platform, where you can share ideas, tools, experience, or suggestions on how to make this policy guide better or ways in which you've been using it. And also, please help us with our campaign to get this in front of as many policymakers as possible. And last, but certainly not least, I hope that you'll start working to build a well-being economy in your community. And I hope that this guide is supportive and helpful, but that you also know that the We All community is here to help you as well, and that you're not alone in believing that we can transform this economic system and to build a more just, kind, and sustainable world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amanda. That was lovely. Paul, you are next up. So Paul's a professor of economics at Lincoln University in New Zealand since 2002, and in 2018 published a book, Wellbeing Economics, the Capabilities Approach to Prosperity. And of course, New Zealand has developed the first ever wellbeing budget, but with that comes some contention, particularly in the time of COVID. So Paul, over to you.
Thank you, Isabel. I'm pleased to greet everyone in the Indigenous Maori language of New Zealand. Kia ora tātou katoa. May you and I, all of us together, enjoy well-being. My country has a long history of measuring the broad well-being of persons, communities, and the natural environment. In late 2017, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern announced the government would move beyond measuring well-being to designing well-being economic policies. As Isabel said, this led to the world's first well-being budget presented to the New Zealand Parliament in May 2019. Despite this history, there remains some uncertainty within the New Zealand Public Service about good policy design for a well-being economy. Indeed, the COVID-19 crisis has led some people to urge a return to promoting economic growth for its own sake. Even supporters of a well-being economy approach sometimes appear unsure about what counts as best practice for rigorous policy design. Consequently, it has been a privilege and an inspiration to help prepare WEAL's Wellbeing Economic Policy Design Guide. The privilege was to share lessons from New Zealand's policy experience. The inspiration was to receive insights from the many other countries who are also designing economic policies to expand the capabilities of people for well-being. Drawing on this wealth of shared experiences, the Policy Design Guide is a very rich resource. It weaves threads from diverse policy experiences in different countries to create a strong fabric. The strength and the richness of the guide will build confidence among policy advisors on how to co-create good policies for a well-being economy, beginning and ending with the lived experiences of people and communities. So let me end as I began. May you and I, all of us together, enjoy well-being. Kia ora tātou katoa.
Thank you, Paul. That is nice. I appreciate, the introduction there. Andy, I am going to pass over to you. But before I do that, quick introduction. So Andy's from the Liverpool City region. And from a UK context, he's confronted with this build back better slogans that seem to be leaning toward build back quickly to what we had before COVID-19. So he'll share his perspective on developing more participatory approaches to policymaking in his local context. Over to you.
Thanks, Isabel. Hi, everyone. Yes, I'm health policy lead for the Liverpool City region, and I'm a public health specialist. So I've got into the wellbeing economy movement from that, just seeing all the things that happen in the world that are making people more poorly, less happy, and that frustration that most of the things that cause these bad things happening to people are beyond our control, and a sort of desire to want to change that. At a national level, in the UK, the UK government hasn't really accepted the premise of a wellbeing economy yet. The devolved regions of Scotland and Wales seem to be progressing a bit further, but there are good signs still. But in the main, economic growth is still considered as a goal in and of itself at national level. But there's been a big move to more inclusive economic models, often led by local government and regional government, which is the level I've been working at. So in the Liverpool City region, for example, our Metro Mayor has a vision for the region to be the most inclusive, fair and socially just economy in the country. And he said that before he'd even heard the term wellbeing economy, so these ideas are already happening, which is good. And so some of the things that we've been trying to do here is we've got a health in all policies approach, which means that improving the health and well-being of residents is central to every one of our strategies now. So our transport strategy is about improving health and well-being. Our planning strategy is about improving health and well-being. Our economic recovery strategy is about improving health and well-being, which is a really good start. We're also working on developing more holistic measures of success, getting past this fixation on growth and GDP and GVA and all these things, and looking into new approaches to participatory policy making. But there's always more we must do. I think too often a nice policy is seen as the end point, pat on the back, job well done, when in fact that's just a start really. We know we need to get out there and make sure that the policy actually does stuff. COVID has obviously highlighted massive levels of inequality that already existed and exacerbated them. I remember at the start of the pandemic, one of our politicians said, something along the lines of, we're all in it together, it's the great leveler, but it's just not true. I've seen a quote somewhere saying, well, we're all in the same storm, but we're not in the same boat, and that's how it feels really. And the COVID, it has also been described not just as a pandemic, but as a syndemic. So it's not just an outbreak of infectious diseases, it's a pandemic sat on top of all the other things that were already happening in the world, the inequality. So it's really exacerbated those issues. Obviously, working in public health, we've known about these things for decades, about inequality in health and income. But it does finally seem like decision makers are finally recognising this too. COVID has been a big wake-up call. But I am still worried, as Isabel said before, that despite all the rhetoric of building back better and building back fairer, many will be tempted to just build back quickly to what we already had. Because even though it wasn't working, it was comfortable. That's what we know. So I'm hoping that this guide will help to ensure that doesn't happen, and let people know that there is another way. We don't just have to go back to the systems that weren't working. I think the guide helps to show that the changes required are not really that difficult in the grand scheme of things. They just require political will and the courage to not just do things because they've always been done. To work with people on what their priorities are rather than what we think their priorities are or what they should be. I think the idea of a well-being economy, one in which the ultimate goal of the economy is to improve the collective well-being of people on the planet, and not just add some zeros to some ethereal spreadsheet in the sky that no one really understands. It's so blindingly obvious to me that I struggled at first to figure out how it can seem so radical, and I think that one reason is that we just haven't made the case well enough. There are lots and lots of progressive economic movements, and there's one status quo, and so we've got these hundreds of arguments making the cases in different ways, and I think what happened is that the message has just got confused, and I think the idea of a well-being economy brings together a lot of these previously disparate and esoteric forms of economic thinking to a single and hopefully easily understood narrative. And this guide, I think, gives that narrative some teeth. It moves it from being purely idealistic to being practical, which is fantastic. So I'll end with just saying, so we've got it now. We've got this narrative. We've got this guide. So we need to use it wisely. We're doing well at showing that the current economic system is the cause of so many of our problems, and hopefully this is now the start, to show that a well-being economy can be the solution. So I hope you all find it useful. Thanks.
Thank you, Andy. So we are going to transition for the last 15 minutes here into a bit of Q&A. So I'm going to ask people to use the function on Zoom. So there's a little button that says reactions, and you can put a little raise hand button like that. And I will call on you, and then we will use their panelists and field some of your questions. Mark, go for it.
Thanks, Isabel. I just, this is fabulous work, but my issue is that if you're in an environment where austerity is the kind of normativity, is the kind of driving reality, then that's going to fatally undermine, I think, these kind of policy decisions. So I'm just interested in how, while this guide gives, the excellent alternatives and the possibilities to move towards a well-being economy, while we're stuck in that wider mindset of capitalist economic growth and austerity, I don't see how these brilliant ideas can get off the ground. So I'm just interested in how, I think something has to go along with this, to allow it to have a chance to kind of grow and impact. And I'm just interested in people's responses to that.
Sure. Thank you, Mark. I'm going to pass that over to Andy. And I'm also going to ask both for the question askers and the answer givers to be as quick as possible. Not that you weren't quick, Mark, but also just to make sure Andy responds quickly. Thank you.
That's very pessimistic, Mark. But no, it's I totally understand what you're saying, and living in the UK in particular, then that has been an issue. So just from a personal perspective, what I've done is it can be really frustrating and you feel like you're banging your head against the wall when you've got governments who aren't doing these things. So I try to look at the positives, and even though we might have a government that has embraced austerity, there's still progress happening. When you see so the UK Treasury now has updated how it measures impact, and it is starting to look more broadly than than GDP on social value and that kind of thing. So you're right, I totally agree. It would be lovely if we woke up tomorrow and everyone just went, oh, right, okay, we're a well-being economy now. But these things do take time, but there's different levels you can do it. If it's not possible nationally, you can do it at a regional level. If it's not possible there, you can do it at a local level. You can do it in your own backyard. But I think it's important, and I've learned this the hard way from spending lots of time feeling really glum about the entire planet. If you look hard enough, there is progress everywhere, and working on this guide has really helped me with that. We will be all right. As a species, we're idiots, and we tend to try our best to ruin everything for ourselves. But we're heading in the right direction. So I agree with what you're saying, and it'll be easier in some places than others. But pretty much everywhere is making progress. So try and keep your chin up.
Thanks, Andy. Next, I'm going to go to Marcus, and I'd also like to encourage any women in the crowd to answer some questions too, or ask some questions. Sorry. Go ahead, Marcus.
We know from research from people like Rebecca Willis and others that politicians are genuinely interested in these sorts of things, the premise of a well-being economy. And we also know from a recent global poll that the population are interested, but politicians don't do anything because they don't get pestered by their constituents. And the constituents don't do anything because they don't see their politicians acting. Has the guide got any insight as to how we can breach this impasse?
Okay, thank you, Marcus. Amanda, do you want to take that one?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, obviously, like this is a challenge that we're stuck in. And I think it was something that I wanted to include in the presentation, but I didn't actually. But it's a pretty incredible survey that came out last year, which is like a global health survey. And it shows that over the majority of people in the world, over half of the people in the world see, one, that they think the current economic system, capitalism, is doing more harm than good. And two, that democracy is eroding and that they feel like their governments are acting, like more in service of the interests of a select few. So there is huge recognition of the challenges, right? And so this is why emphasis on communication is really key here, right? And so this guide also is meant to just be a starting point where, as I said, I think it's really important that we focus not only on getting this in front of policymakers, but we also focus on galvanizing public demand, right? We need to also ourselves recognize that we can influence economic policy, right? Let's start with that ourselves, realizing that we are the economy, that it's just the way we produce and provide for one another, and we have a right and a responsibility to mold and direct how that system looks, right? And so if we can start with that perspective and then also engage in pushing for more deliberative processes, then I think that all of these things are fully possible because the realization is there. It's now just time for the action.
Boom. Yes. Martin, you are next.
Thank you very much, and good evening from the Netherlands. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Thanks for the presentation, and it's a very interesting new policy guide that you're presenting. So my question, I already also have put in the chat. It is around measurement, and I think it was Amanda who said that there's quite some flexibility explicitly in a measurement, so no prescription there, which on the one hand, I fully understand. For those of you who don't meet, and the organization I work for, the Capitals Coalition, we launched the Natural Capital Protocol 2016 and the Social Human Capital Protocol 2018. And also at that stage, these guides that were frameworks targeted towards business and finance to help them include nature and social and human capital into their decisions, were quite flexible and open, and we didn't prescribe anything. However, what we've learned is when time progresses, the need for more harmonization and standardization really hits us back. And so we are now in a process of standardizing the way how business and finance understand the value of nature and people in their decisions. Also, the UN last week, they've adopted a standard for natural capital, how to include that in national statistics. So I wonder how you're seeing this, and do you expect the same, that in the beginning it's a little bit more open, but in time it definitely will, you will develop a process where more standardization and alignment will be developed. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Paul, I'm going to go to you, and then I thought maybe
Sure.
Catherine Trebek might be able to input a little bit as well. So first to you.
Sure. So one of the foundational principles behind the guide is respecting diversity among different communities. And certainly in my own country in New Zealand, the understanding of relationships with nature of Indigenous Maori communities and settler Pākehā communities can be quite different. So we are anxious not to look for harmonization early in the process. And even at the end of the process, there has to be room for diversity of values and diversity of experience reflected in the indicators that we are using to measure well-being. So for comparisons, it can be useful to have a core set of harmonized measures eventually, but even in that system, there has to be room for diversity and respect for diversity, because we learn from each other. That's how we build the strong fabric, by drawing on different perspectives, and the system of measurement needs always to make room for that diversity to be reflected in the measures.
Thank you, Paul. Catherine, do you have anything? I don't mean to put you on the spotlight. I know you weren't planning to speak, but.
Just very briefly, I think so often there's a direct tension between comparability across different regions and the extent of participation. And we just need to grapple with that. I firmly come down on the participation aspect. I think the old paradigm is one of league tables and who's better than each other and rankings. And don't get me wrong, they matter. That spurs others to move. But I also think if we're going to have a chance at changing the old outdated economic paradigm, it also has to be a shift in power. And so that requires us to put the voices at the forefront of defining what progress is about, of relevant communities. And that might mean we lose some comparability, but what we gain in that is the beginnings of the sort of power shift that prefigures the sort of change we need across our economy. But having said that, there are some, as Paul said, some commonalities and shared concerns. These are the sort of things that make us innately human. So we can look at those. But for me, it's about recognizing there is that profound tension and celebrating what comes from communities upward that's locational specific. So for example, in New Zealand, they built on the OECD's framework, but very much added in the idea of the cultural values and cultural diversity, because that was so appropriate for New Zealand. They couldn't just take the OECD's framework and run with it and say, that's great. That would have completely been inappropriate. So we've just got to manage that and try as best we can to get the best of both worlds, but be honest about those tensions.
Great, thank you, Catherine. Okay, so we have 4 minutes left. I would love for a woman in the room to raise her hand and ask a question.
I would also just like to mention that there's a lot more of the authors here today as well. So if any of the authors wanna come in with anything as well, that'd be great.
Lovely. Let's go with Jackie. And then
Hey, hi. Thank you. In parallel, by the way, I gave a public lecture on this, and it was quite extraordinary. I mean, we had about 800 people zoomed into it. But the most important thing that I thought was when Mark Carney asked me about how the banking and the climate finance and all of this could become more aligned. And there was a tremendous reaction. So in response to the slightly, pessimistic view, I think that the policy guidance is set at exactly the right level. It opens so many doors at different levels. So I just wanted to say, I think it's very useful, and it's a very subtle document, and I think it's already going to have an impact in just opening up. And just one example: land trusts, all these different ways of thinking about assets and resources instead of the selfish world, thinking about more community work. It's so clear, and the examples I think in the policy guidance really show that many people have been at this for a very long time. Yes, that is Mark Zero Carbon Carney. Yes, but also very, very, very interested in picking this up. So it was good news. Yeah.
Thank you, Jackie. Laura, very quickly, and then Amanda, I'm going to turn to you to close. Yeah.
I have a very quick question for Paul, which is, how are you managing that piece of policymakers and the fear of making mistakes in New Zealand?
Well, that's universal under any system. It is an experimental process. The child poverty work, for example, is one of the big steps we took in introducing the wellbeing economy. And we have set up a framework of statistical indicators so that we recognize when we're making genuine progress and when we recognize that this policy has not been effective. And there's a range of responses to mistakes in my country, from the very punitive to the very forgiving. And I think this is part of the culture of policy design process. We want to encourage experimentation. As Amanda said, we learn from our mistakes. That's the important thing. And over time, as we pass on what we know to the next generation, they will make less mistakes or perhaps different mistakes. And that way we make genuine progress.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, Amanda, you want to close this out?
Absolutely. Well, I just want to thank you all for coming today. I hope that you'll continue to be engaged in this process as we try to put some of these ideas into action. One thing I'll just note is Isabel just shared in the chat this forum, and it's so if you have any policymaker, this can be a local policymaker, a national one, at any level, who you think might be engaged in learning more, we're going to have a special policymakers event in May. So this will be a forum for them to sort of sign up to learn more, so we can, really try to connect with as many people around the world as possible with this. But thank you. I really, really appreciate you taking the time to listen to this. And I look forward to collaborating and connecting with you all in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.